animals sense things humans miss. Chemical traces in the soil, changes in air pressure, dangers we can't detect. But when 30 chickens refuse to cross a narrow dirt path for 2 solid weeks, there's something down there worth investigating. Amos Granger stood by his fence, watching his flock scatter around the path like it burned their feet. They'd peck and scratch right up to the edges, then turn away with sharp, agitated movements. He'd inherited this ranch from his deceased brother just 6 weeks ago, but this strange behavior started the moment he moved his chickens to this section of the property. The path itself looked unremarkable. About 8 feet wide, cutting straight from the main yard toward the old storage shed. But nothing grew there, which struck him as odd for late spring. Every other patch of ground sprouted weeds and wildflowers, yet this strip remained bare as a bone. Mabel emerged from the house wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. At 24, she had her mother's practical nature and her father's stubborn curiosity. She'd come out from town to help him settle the estate, though Amos suspected she mainly wanted distance from whatever romantic trouble she'd left behind. "Still studying those birds?" she asked, joining him at the fence. 2 weeks, Mabel. 2 weeks and not one will set foot on that ground. She followed his gaze to the bare strip. Maybe the soil's too acidic, or there's old fertilizer making it smell wrong. Amos had considered that. He'd walked the path himself, even knelt down and smelled the earth. It had a faint chemical odor, barely noticeable to human senses but strong enough to make him wrinkle his nose. Sweet and harsh at the same time, like old paint mixed with something medicinal. "Gideon's coming by today to help repair the shed roof," Mabel said. "He worked for Uncle Frank for years. If anyone knows about this land, it's him." Gideon Nash had been Frank's hired hand for over a decade. A steady man with calloused hands and careful eyes who knew every inch of the property. Amos was grateful he'd agreed to stay on during the transition. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the yard. A bold red hen approached the path's edge, bobbed her head nervously, then darted away like she'd stepped on hot coals. The same reaction, over and over. It reminded Amos of how animals acted around poisonous plants or contaminated water. "There's something in that soil," he said quietly. "Something that makes them afraid." Mabel frowned. "You mean like chemicals? Pesticides?" Before Amos could answer, they heard wagon wheels on gravel. Gideon appeared through the morning dust, his weathered face unreadable as always. But when his eyes found the bare path, something shifted in his expression, something that looked like uncomfortable recognition. As Gideon climbed down from his wagon, Amos noticed how the man's movements became more deliberate, more careful. His horse, normally eager to graze, kept its distance from that strip of ground. And when Gideon started unloading tools, Amos caught him glancing repeatedly at the path with the wary look of a man who knew exactly why those chickens wouldn't cross it. Gideon worked on the shed roof with practiced efficiency, but Amos noticed how he positioned himself to keep the bare path in his peripheral vision. When Mabel brought him water at midday, the older man accepted it gratefully, though his attention kept drifting toward that strip of ground. "Gideon," Amos finally said, setting down his hammer, "you know why nothing grows on that path." The hired hand's movement stilled. He sat back on his heels, considering his words carefully. "Your brother never told you about the old workshop?" "What workshop?" "Frank had a little operation going about 15 years back. Nothing big, just mixing up pest control solutions for the neighboring ranches." Gideon climbed down from the roof, his boots hitting the ground with deliberate heaviness. "Had himself a small building right where that path runs now." Mabel stepped closer. "What happened to it?" "Burned down one night. Frank said it was an accident, electrical fire, but—" Gideon paused, wiping sweat from his forehead. "That fire burned hot and fast. Too fast for just wood and nails." Amos felt a chill despite the afternoon heat. "You're saying there were chemicals stored there? All kinds of things. Arsenic-based pesticides, mercury compounds, stuff they don't make anymore because it's too dangerous." Gideon's jaw tightened. "When that building went up, Frank had me help him clean up the mess. We scraped up what we could, but that soil was soaked through with Lord knows what." The chickens suddenly grew agitated, clustering at the far end of their pen. A rooster stood with his feathers ruffled, eyeing the path like it was a snake ready to strike. "Why didn't Frank ever tell me?" Amos asked. Frank was ashamed. He'd been selling those chemicals to people without proper licenses, cutting corners to make extra money. Gideon's voice carried old disappointment. When that fire happened, he realized how dangerous his operation had been. Could have poisoned half the county if the wind had been wrong. Mabel studied the bare ground with new understanding. So the soil is contaminated. That's why nothing grows and why the animals avoid it. That's what I always figured. Frank had me spread fresh dirt over the worst of it, but you can't just bury that kind of contamination and expect it to disappear. A faint breeze stirred across the yard, and with it came that chemical smell again, stronger now that Amos knew what to look for. Sweet and harsh, like old paint thinner mixed with something medicinal. There might be containers still buried down there, Gideon continued. Frank was in a panic that night, trying to save what he could. Some of those chemical drums were too heavy to move before the fire spread. Amos stared at the path, his mind racing. If there were sealed containers of dangerous chemicals deteriorating underground, it would explain everything. The soil contamination, the animal behavior, even the slight depression that seemed to be forming as old containers rusted and collapsed. But it also meant they were sitting on a potential environmental disaster that could affect their water supply, their livestock, and anyone living downstream. That evening, Amos couldn't concentrate on anything else. The revelation about Frank's chemical operation churned in his mind like sour milk. His brother had always been a corner cutter, someone who saw regulations as suggestions rather than rules. But this was different. This could hurt people. Mabel found him standing at the kitchen window, staring out at the path in the fading light. "You're thinking about digging it up, aren't you? If there are containers down there leaking into the groundwater, we need to know." Amos rubbed his jaw, feeling the weight of responsibility. "Our well is only 50 yards from that spot. But if we dig and find chemicals, we'll have to report it. The government will come in, test everything, probably condemn the whole property." That was the heart of it. Amos had sunk his life savings into buying out his brother's estate. If the land was declared contaminated, he'd lose everything. But if he did nothing and those chemicals eventually poisoned someone... Gideon said some of the neighboring ranches bought those pesticides from Frank, Amos said quietly. What if their wells are contaminated too? What if families are drinking water that's slowly poisoning them? Mabel leaned against the window frame beside him. "You think Frank knew how bad it was?" "I think Frank spent 15 years praying nobody would ever find out." Amos turned from the window, his decision crystallizing. "Tomorrow we dig. We find out what's down there. And if it's as bad as we think, then we do the right thing, even if it costs us everything." They went to bed early, but Amos lay awake listening to the sounds of the night. Around midnight, he heard a faint creaking from outside, like old metal under stress. He got up and looked out the window, but saw nothing unusual. Just that bare patch of ground, darker than the surrounding earth in the moonlight. The next morning brought Gideon earlier than expected. The hired hand looked like he hadn't slept much either, his face drawn with worry. "Been thinking about yesterday's conversation," Gideon said without preamble. "There's something else you should know before you start digging." Amos felt his stomach drop. "What?" "Frank wasn't just selling to local ranchers. He had customers from 3 counties over, people who paid cash and didn't ask questions." Gideon's hands twisted his hat brim. "Some of those chemicals, they weren't just for pest control." "What do you mean?" "Mercury compounds, industrial solvents, things that could be used for other purposes." Gideon met his eyes directly. Frank never said it outright, but I think some of his customers were using those chemicals to process gold illegally. Strip mining operations that didn't want to pay for proper environmental controls. Mabel appeared from the house carrying shovels and a pick. "So we're not just talking about local contamination. We're talking about Frank being part of a network that poisoned half the territory," Amos said grimly. "And all the evidence is buried right under our feet." The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard as they approached the path. The chickens watched nervously from their pen, sensing something momentous was about to happen. The first shovelful of dirt revealed soil that was darker than it should be, with an oily sheen that caught the morning light. The chemical smell grew stronger as they dug, sharp enough to make their eyes water. Mabel tied a cloth around her nose and mouth, but continued working. 2 feet down, Amos's shovel struck something solid. Not the hollow sound of metal, but something dense and unyielding. He scraped away more soil, revealing the corner of what looked like a wooden crate. "That's not how chemicals were stored," Gideon said, leaning over the hole. "Those would be in metal drums or glass containers." Amos worked to expose more of the crate. It was roughly 3 feet long, made of heavy oak that had darkened with age but remained surprisingly intact. Iron bands held it together and there was no visible lock. Frank buried this separately from the chemical drums, Mabel observed. This was hidden on purpose. Gideon's face had gone pale. "Amos, maybe we should stop here. Call the authorities. Let them handle it. After we see what's inside. Amos pried at the lid with his shovel blade. The wood was swollen from moisture but finally gave way with a loud crack. What they found inside made all three of them step back from the hole. Stacks of documents in oiled cloth wrapping, leather-bound ledgers that had survived the moisture, and beneath those, small glass vials filled with various powders and liquids, each carefully labeled in Frank's handwriting. Amos pulled out one of the ledgers and opened it carefully. Page after page of transactions, names, dates, and chemical formulas. But these weren't simple pesticide sales. These were detailed records of custom chemical mixtures, with notes about their specific uses. Mercury amalgam solution for Johnson Mining, Amos read aloud. Cyanide processing aid for Black Rock operation. Dear God, Frank, what were you thinking? Mabel lifted out one of the document bundles. Inside were letters, contracts, and what looked like government inspection reports that had been altered. He was falsifying safety documents, making illegal mining operations look legitimate. There's more, Gideon said quietly, pointing to the bottom of the crate. Those vials aren't just samples. Look at the labels. Amos leaned closer. The handwriting was Frank's, but the contents were terrifying. Concentrated mercury, emergency disposal, arsenic compound, evidence, cyanide residue, do not test. He kept evidence, Mabel breathed. Frank kept proof of everything he did. If you were Amos, what would you do? Turn over evidence that could expose widespread environmental crimes but destroy innocent families whose land might be contaminated. Or rebury the crate and protect people from devastating news they can't change. Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose, because what Amos decided next would determine whether Frank's crime stayed buried or brought justice to an entire territory. The sound of approaching horses made them all freeze. Through the morning dust, they could see three riders heading toward the ranch, and something about their purposeful approach suggested this wasn't a social visit. The three riders approached with the measured pace of men accustomed to getting their way. Amos quickly closed the ledger and motioned for Mabel and Gideon to cover the crate with their coats. Whatever was about to happen, he didn't want these strangers seeing what they'd found. The lead rider was a well-dressed man in his 50s, with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. His companions looked like hired muscle, the kind of men who settled disputes with fists rather than words. Amos Granger? The leader called out as he dismounted. Name's Harlan Briggs. I represent certain business interests that had dealings with your late brother. Frank's business died with him, Amos replied carefully. I'm just ranching now. Briggs smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. See, that's where we have a problem. Frank had something that belongs to my clients. Records of transactions, chemical formulas, that sort of thing. We're here to collect what's ours. Gideon stepped closer to Amos, his hand resting casually on the hammer hanging from his belt. The older man might not look like much, but Amos had seen him handle trouble before. I don't know anything about Frank's chemical business, Amos said. When he died, I inherited land and livestock. That's all. Come now, Mr. Granger. We know Frank kept detailed records. Very detailed. Briggs's tone remained pleasant, but there was steel underneath. Those records could be embarrassing to certain people if they fell into the wrong hands. Mabel spoke up from beside the hole. What kind of people get embarrassed by business records? One of Briggs's men started to move toward her, but Briggs held up a hand. The kind of people who value privacy. Miss. The kind who don't appreciate government interference in legitimate business operations. Amos felt pieces clicking together in his mind. You're from the mining companies, the ones Frank was helping hide their illegal operations. I'm from concerned parties who want to resolve this matter quietly and profitably for everyone involved. Briggs reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope. There's $5,000 here, Mr. Granger. More than enough to forget whatever you might have found on this property. The smell of chemicals drifted up from the partially covered crate, and Amos saw Briggs's nostrils flare slightly. The man knew exactly what they'd been digging for. And if I don't take your money, then you might find ranching in this territory much more difficult than expected. Cattle get sick, wells go dry, accidents happen. Briggs's smile never wavered. Of course, none of that would be necessary if we could reach a reasonable agreement. Gideon shifted position, and Amos caught the glint of afternoon sun on the blade of his knife. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. I need time to think about your offer, Amos said finally. Of course, but don't take too long. Briggs remounted his horse with fluid grace. We'll be back tomorrow for your answer. And Mr. Granger, I do hope you'll make the smart choice." As the three riders disappeared into the distance, Mabel pulled the coats away from the crate. "They knew exactly what we'd find down here." "Which means," Amos said grimly, "Frank wasn't the only one who knew where the evidence was buried." If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. That night, none of them slept well. Amos spent hours at the kitchen table, poring over Frank's ledgers by lamplight. The scope of the operation was staggering. Chemical sales to at least 15 different mining operations across 3 territories, all of them using processes that should have been banned years ago. But it was the personal letters that hit him hardest. Notes from miners describing workers getting sick, families complaining about poisoned water supplies, and Frank's responses promising discretion and plausible solutions. Mabel found him there at dawn, his face haggard with exhaustion and grief. "How many people do you think were affected?" "Hundreds, maybe thousands." Amos closed the ledger with trembling hands. Frank wasn't just cutting corners. He was helping these companies poison entire communities for profit. Gideon appeared in the doorway, fully dressed despite the early hour. "Been thinking all night about what Briggs said, about accidents happening." He sat down heavily at the table. "There's something else you need to know about your brother." "More bad news?" "Frank tried to get out of the business about 5 years ago. Said he wanted to go clean, just ranch like a normal person." Gideon's weathered hands fidgeted with his hat. 2 weeks later, his barn burned down. Then his well went bad. Then someone shot his prize bull. Amos felt ice in his stomach. Briggs and his people. Frank never said it outright, but he got the message. Once you're in business with these folks, you don't just walk away. Gideon met his eyes directly. That's why he kept all those records. Insurance, in case they ever tried to hurt him. Mabel studied the pile of evidence on the table. So Frank was protecting himself, but now that protection falls to us. And Briggs knows it, Amos said. That's why he's being so polite. He can't just take the evidence by force, because if anything happens to us, those records might surface anyway. Through the window, they could see the bare patch of ground where they'd made their discovery. In the morning light, it looked innocent enough, just an area where nothing grew. But Amos now understood it represented something much larger. A graveyard of secrets that Frank had carried to his own grave. "There's a territorial marshal in Copper Falls," Gideon said quietly. "Man named Walker. He's been asking questions about mining operations, trying to build cases against the illegal ones. You think he'd be interested in Frank's records?" "I think he'd be very interested. But getting those records to him alive might be the trick." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses drifted across the morning air. But this time it wasn't 3 riders. This time it was more. Amos went to the window and counted 7 men on horseback, with Briggs in the lead. They weren't coming to negotiate anymore. They were coming to take what they wanted. "Hide the evidence," Amos said urgently. "Everything back in the crate, and the crate somewhere they'll never find it." But as Gideon started gathering the ledgers, Mabel grabbed his arm. "Wait, what if we don't hide it? What if we use it?" Her father and Gideon both stared at her, not understanding. "Briggs thinks he holds all the cards because he can threaten us. But what if he knew that threatening us would guarantee those records reach the marshal?" Mabel's plan was dangerous but brilliant. While Gideon hid the original crate in the root cellar, she and Amos quickly copied key pages from Frank's ledgers. When Briggs and his men rode into the yard, Amos was waiting on the porch with a single ledger in his hands. "Mr. Granger," Briggs called out, dismounting with his usual confidence. "I trust you've had time to consider our generous offer." "I have." Amos held up the ledger. "And I've decided to counter-propose." Briggs's eyes fixed on the book with predatory intensity. "I'm listening." "This ledger contains records of chemical sales to the Blackrock mining operation. Sales of mercury and cyanide compounds that poisoned the Miller Creek watershed." Amos's voice carried across the yard, making sure all of Briggs's men could hear. 15 families downstream got sick from drinking that water. "Accidents happen in mining country," Briggs said smoothly, but his hand had moved to rest on his gun. This wasn't an accident. According to Frank's notes, Blackrock knew the chemicals would contaminate the creek. They just didn't care. Amos opened the ledger to a marked page. "Your company saved $3,000 by using illegal processing methods instead of proper containment." One of Briggs's men shifted nervously in his saddle. "Boss, maybe we should just—" "Shut up," Briggs snapped, his composure finally cracking. "Granger, you're playing a very dangerous game." "No, I'm ending one." Amos closed the ledger with a snap. See, this morning I sent copies of these records to Marshall Walker in Copper Falls, along with a letter explaining that if anything happens to me, my family, or my property, he should investigate every mining operation listed in Frank's books. Briggs's face went white with rage. You have no idea what you've done. I've done what my brother should have done years ago. Amos stepped down from the porch, no longer afraid. I've chosen to stop being part of the problem. For a tense moment, the yard was silent, except for the nervous stamping of horses. Then Gideon emerged from the house carrying a rifle, and Mabel appeared at the kitchen window with another. Not to start a fight, but to make it clear that any violence would have consequences. Briggs looked around at his men, then back at Amos. The calculation was simple. Killing a family wouldn't stop the evidence from reaching the authorities now, but it would guarantee a murder investigation that could expose everything. This isn't over, Briggs said finally, remounting his horse. Yes, it is, Amos replied. For Frank, for all the families that got poisoned, and for anyone else who might have been hurt, it's over. After the riders disappeared, the three of them stood in the yard for a long time, feeling the weight of what they'd accomplished. The chickens, as if sensing that some invisible danger had passed, finally ventured close to the path where nothing grew. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. Marshall Walker arrived 3 days later with a team of investigators. The evidence Frank had kept led to the closure of 7 illegal mining operations and the arrest of 12 men, including Harlan Briggs. Compensation was eventually paid to the affected families, though no amount of money could undo the damage to their health. Amos used his portion to properly clean the contaminated soil on his property, and within 2 years, wildflowers grew where the chemical workshop once stood. Mabel stayed on to help run the ranch, finding that honest work suited her better than the troubled life she'd left behind in town. Gideon lived out his remaining years, knowing he'd finally done right by both Frank's memory and the communities that had suffered. The land healed, as land always does when given the chance, and the chickens never avoided that path again. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video now.